Before we begin, please be advised that this presentation explores themes of psychological suspense, unexplained phenomena, and existential dread. Listener discretion is advised. Imagine for a moment that you hold something in your hands, something ancient, beautiful, and utterly inert, a relic of a forgotten time, a curiosity. You place it on your shelf, a new addition to your home, a conversation piece. But what if that object isn't just in your home? What if it begins to inhabit your reality, not as a silent witness, but as an active, malevolent participant? What if it begins to rewrite the rules of your world, twist the fabric of your sanity, and absolutely refuse to be contained? This isn't a story about a haunted house. It's about a haunted thing. A thing that doesn't just reside within walls, but resides within you once you let it in. And once it's in, getting it out becomes the most terrifying, impossible task of your life. This is the story of the Viridian box. It started, as most nightmares do, with something completely ordinary. For David Miller, a 32-year-old architectural designer living in a quiet suburban town just outside Portland, Oregon, it began with an estate sale. Not a grand, sprawling auction of priceless artifacts, but a humble, slightly melancholy affair in a house that smelled faintly of mothballs and fading memories. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Eleanor Vance, had passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving behind a lifetime of accumulated treasures and trinkets. David wasn't a collector, not really. He was more of a browser, a seeker of unique pieces that could add character to his minimalist apartment. He'd gone that Saturday morning mostly out of curiosity, lured by the promise of mid-century modern furniture he could potentially refinish. He walked through the quiet rooms, past antique porcelain figurines and dusty leather-bound books, feeling a pang of wistful sadness for a life lived and now packed away. He found it in the study, tucked away on a lower shelf, partially obscured by a stack of old magazines. It was a small wooden box, no larger than a paperback novel, crafted from a wood so dark it was almost black, with an unnatural sheen that caught the dim light. Its surface was intricately carved with what looked like swirling, interlocking patterns, not quite geometric, not quite organic, but something in between, reminiscent of ancient knotwork you might see in a forgotten manuscript. There was no visible lock, no hinges, no obvious way to open it. It was completely seamless, a solid block of dark sculpted wood. Something about it captivated him. It wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, it was intriguing, mysterious. It felt impossibly old, yet oddly pristine, as if time had simply bypassed it. He picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, dense and cool to the touch. The carvings felt strange under his fingertips, almost like braille, but he couldn't discern any discernible pattern or meaning. He tried to find a seam, a catch, anything to suggest it opened, but there was nothing. It was just a box. A sealed, enigmatic box. A young woman, probably Mrs. Vance's granddaughter, was sitting at a folding table near the doorway, handling sales. Her name tag read Jessica. David brought the box to her. "How much for this?" he asked, holding it up. Jessica barely glanced at it. "Oh, that old thing? My grandma always kept it. Never opened it. Said it was just a decoration. You can have it for $5. $5. A pittance for something that felt so utterly unique. David paid, a sense of mild triumph bubbling inside him. He'd found something truly interesting. He wrapped it carefully in an old newspaper and carried it home. That evening, the Viridian box sat on his coffee table. David circled it, examined it under a brighter lamp, ran his fingers over its smooth, dark surface. He tried again to find a way in, pushing and twisting, listening for any telltale click. Nothing. It was a perfectly sealed puzzle. He even tried gently shaking it, but heard no rattle, no indication of anything loose inside. It was a solid, silent mystery. He eventually gave up, shrugged, and placed it on his bedside table, thinking it would make an interesting piece of decor. A conversation starter. He went to bed feeling content, the strange box already fading into the background of his new acquisition. The first incident was subtle, almost imperceptible, easily dismissed. David woke up in the middle of the night, not from a dream but from a feeling, a coldness that permeated his room, despite the mild spring air outside. He pulled his blanket tighter, shivering slightly. Then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, or perhaps static from a radio that wasn't there. He sat up, straining his ears in the absolute darkness. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. He dismissed it as a dream fragment, a trick of the mind. The next morning he found his car keys on the kitchen counter. Not in the ceramic bowl by the door where he always left them. He paused, frowning. He was meticulous about his keys. Always in the bowl. He must have been distracted last night. He simply moved them back and went about his day. A few days later, the whispers returned, louder this time. He was reading in bed, the Viridian box sitting silently on his nightstand. He distinctly heard a series of soft, rapid murmurs just at the edge of his hearing. He snapped his head up, looking around the room. His window was closed. No one else was home. Goosebumps prickled his arms. He reached out, his hand hovering over the box, a strange intuition telling him the sound was coming from it. But how? It was wood. Solid. He moved the box to his living room, placing it on a bookshelf, hoping to distance himself from the unsettling feeling. He told himself he was being foolish, letting his imagination run wild over an old trinket. That night, he woke to a crash from the kitchen. His heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by his bed and crept out. The kitchen was dark. He flicked on the light. A ceramic mug, one he'd owned for years, lay shattered on the floor, shards scattered around a widening puddle of coffee. It had been sitting on the counter, far from the edge. No earthquake. No open windows. Just a broken mug. He cleaned it up, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. This wasn't just forgetfulness or imagination anymore. He started noticing other things. Small, unsettling displacements. Books he'd left neatly stacked on his desk would be found slightly askew, as if someone had idly flicked through them. A framed photograph of his parents, usually straight, would be tilted. His alarm clock, which he always set for 6:30 a.m., would sometimes be found reset to 3 a.m., or even 12 p.m. He lived alone. He had no pets. He was careful about security. The whispers, too, grew bolder. They were no longer just static. Sometimes, he thought he could almost discern words, indistinct and ancient sounding, like a language he'd never heard, yet somehow familiar in its unsettling cadence. He'd be in the shower, and a sudden rush of cold air would hit him, accompanied by a rapid-fire series of these low, guttural sounds, making him jump. He tried to rationalize it. Stress. Sleep deprivation. The creaks and groans of an old apartment building. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was becoming overwhelming. And always, in the periphery of his unease, was the silent, dark presence of the Viridian box. He'd moved it from the bedside table to the bookshelf to a cabinet in the living room, trying to relegate it to a forgotten corner. But no matter where he put it, he felt its presence. It had become the focal point of his anxiety. One evening, David was making dinner when his phone, which was charging on the kitchen counter, suddenly rang. It was his sister, Emily. "Hey, what's up?" he asked, picking it up. "David? Are you okay?" Emily's voice was sharp with concern. "Yeah, why wouldn't I be? You just called me. You didn't say anything, just heavy breathing, then a weird static sound, and then you hung up." David blinked. "I didn't call you, Emily. My phone's been on the charger for the last hour." He looked at the screen. No outgoing calls. No missed calls. "That's impossible," she insisted. "It was your number. I even heard, I don't know, it sounded like someone was whispering in the background, really fast." It freaked me out. A chill, colder than any he'd felt before, crawled up David's spine. He walked slowly to the living room, his eyes fixed on the cabinet where the Viridian box now sat. He pulled it open. The box was there, dark and still, but the air around it felt heavy, charged. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and closed the cabinet door. He tried to laugh it off with Emily, blaming a network glitch, but he knew. He knew with a cold, terrifying certainty that something was wrong. Profoundly, fundamentally wrong. The object wasn't just causing strange occurrences around it. It was actively reaching out, making its presence known, blurring the lines between reality and something far more sinister. The next morning, David decided he'd had enough. This was ridiculous. He wasn't a superstitious man. He was a rational, modern individual. Whatever this thing was, it was getting to him, playing on his nerves. He would simply get rid of it. He would throw it away. He walked into the living room, pulled open the cabinet, and reached for the Viridian box. As his fingers brushed against its dark wood, a sudden blinding flash of light erupted from it, accompanied by a deafening guttural shriek that seemed to tear through the very air. David cried out, stumbling backward, crashing into the coffee table. He squeezed his eyes shut, hands clamped over his ears, the piercing sound resonating deep within his skull. When he finally dared to open his eyes, the room was dark again. The air was thick with the faint scent of ozone. The Viridian box sat exactly where it had been, utterly inert, utterly silent. But David was shaking uncontrollably. His head throbbed. He looked at his hand, the one that had touched the box. A faint red mark like a burn was etched into his palm. He stared at the box, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't some harmless antique. This wasn't his imagination. This thing was alive, and it didn't want to leave. A new horrifying thought solidified in his mind. This wasn't just a haunted object. This was an object that had chosen him, and it was absolutely determined to stay. He had tried to reject it, to contain it, but it had shown him with terrifying clarity that it would not be contained. Not by a cabinet, not by a trash can, not by anything. And this, he realized with a sickening lurch of dread, was only the beginning. That sickening lurch of dread twisted into a cold, paralyzing knot in Michael's stomach. The antique music box, the one he had just thrown into the kitchen trash, sat innocently on his coffee table. Its polished dark wood gleamed under the dim living room light, reflecting the terror in his wide, bloodshot eyes. It wasn't just back. It was as if it had never left. There was no sign of the crumpled paper towels or the coffee grounds he'd piled on top of it. No scent of the lingering dinner from the trash can. It was pristine, untouched, a silent, mocking testament to its own defiance. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. His breath hitched in his throat, and the air in the apartment felt heavy, suffocating. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to smash it, to do something, but he was frozen, trapped in a chilling tableau with the impossible object. He could almost hear a faint tinkling melody, though he knew it was just his mind playing tricks, a phantom echo of the tune it had played before. Finally, with a gasp, Michael stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of magazines. The sudden noise jolted him out of his trance. He scrambled to his feet, his gaze never leaving the music box. He backed away slowly, step by agonizing step, until his back hit the wall. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the encroaching silence. He stayed like that for hours, slumped against the wall, watching the music box. The darkness of night crept in, painting the room in deep shadows, yet the music box seemed to glow faintly, an unnatural luminescence emanating from its dark surface. He didn't dare turn on more lights, as if doing so would acknowledge its presence even further, solidify its hold on his reality. Sleep was an impossibility. Every creak of the old apartment building, every distant siren, every rustle of the leaves outside his window sent shivers down his spine. He hallucinated movement in his peripheral vision, caught fleeting glimpses of shadows that weren't there. His mind, usually so rational and orderly, was unraveling at the seams. When the first rays of dawn finally pierced through the curtains, casting weak, gray light into the room, Michael felt a flicker of desperate resolve. He couldn't live like this. He wouldn't live like this. He had to get rid of it, permanently. He approached the coffee table cautiously, as if the music box might spring to life and attack him. His hand trembled as he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth wood. It felt utterly normal, deceptively inert. He snatched it up, the unexpected lightness of it almost making him drop it. He wrapped it in a thick old towel, then shoved it into a backpack, burying it under clothes and books. Out of sight, out of mind, he hoped, a futile prayer whispered to himself. He grabbed his car keys and practically sprinted out of the apartment, the backpack bouncing awkwardly against his back. He drove aimlessly at first, his mind racing, searching for a place, any place, where this cursed object could never return. A landfill? Too public. A river? It might just float back. The ocean? Miles away. He settled on the dense, sprawling woods that bordered the edge of town, a place where people rarely ventured beyond the marked hiking trails. He drove deep down a winding, unpaved road, leaving the last signs of civilization behind. The trees grew thicker here, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a perpetual twilight. Parking his car on a small, overgrown turnout, Michael grabbed the backpack. The weight of the music box inside felt like a lead anvil dragging him down. He plunged into the woods, pushing through thorny bushes and over fallen logs, his shoes sinking into the damp earth. He walked for what felt like miles, deeper and deeper, until the sounds of traffic were replaced by the rustle of leaves and the chirping of unseen birds. He found a secluded spot, a small clearing surrounded by ancient, gnarled oak trees. He dropped the backpack and began to dig. He didn't have a shovel, so he used his bare hands, tearing at the earth with desperate urgency. Dirt caked under his fingernails, his muscles ached, but he didn't stop until he had created a deep, dark hole. He pulled the music box out of the backpack, unwrapping the towel. It still looked the same, mocking him with its innocent facade. He raised it high, intending to smash it against a tree trunk, to shatter its delicate mechanism into 1,000 pieces. But a strange, unsettling chill ran through his arm. A whisper, faint and barely perceptible, seemed to brush against his ear, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He faltered, his resolve wavering for a fraction of a second. He shook his head, refusing to be swayed. This was just fear, just his mind playing tricks again. He wouldn't give in. He tossed the music box into the hole, the thud of it hitting the bottom echoing ominously in the quiet woods. Then, with renewed vigor, he began to shovel the earth back in, burying it under layers of soil, rocks, and dead leaves. He stomped on the ground, compacting it, erasing any sign of his disturbed grave. He stood there for a long time, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face, staring at the freshly disturbed earth. It was done. It had to be done. He felt a fragile sense of relief, a thin veneer over the lingering dread. He turned and stumbled back through the woods, retracing his steps, the return journey feeling infinitely longer than the trek in. He finally reached his car, exhausted and filthy. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery hues. He drove home in a daze, the silence in the car a stark contrast to the frantic thoughts that had plagued him hours earlier. He tried to convince himself it was over, that he had finally broken free from its grasp. He unlocked his apartment door, the familiar click echoing too loudly in the sudden quiet. He stepped inside, the air still heavy and strangely cold. He took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of being home, of being free. He walked into the living room, intending to collapse onto the couch, to finally get some rest. And then he saw it. On the center of his coffee table, exactly where he had seen it that morning, exactly where he had seen it the night before, sat the antique music box. It was impossibly, undeniably there. It wasn't covered in dirt. It wasn't scratched or damaged. It was pristine, as if it had simply been waiting for him. And this time it wasn't silent. A faint, distorted melody wafted from its tiny mechanism, a lullaby twisted into a dirge, each note a chilling whisper of defiance. The tune was slow, mournful, yet undeniably the same tune it had played before, only now it carried an undercurrent of malevolence, a mocking triumph. Michael's blood ran cold. The fragile relief he had felt shattered into a million pieces, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. He stared at it, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. He had driven miles. He had buried it deep. He had returned to an empty apartment. How? How was this possible? He staggered backward, his legs giving out, and he collapsed onto the floor. The sound of the music box, though faint, seemed to grow louder, filling the room, filling his head. It was no longer just an object. It was an entity, a malevolent force that defied all logic, all reason, all physical laws. It was playing with him, toying with his sanity. A cold dread, far deeper than anything he had felt before, settled over him. This wasn't just a haunted object. It was something that could transcend space, time, and the very concept of disposal. It wouldn't be contained. It wouldn't be gotten rid of. It was bound to him, or perhaps he was bound to it. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was trapped in his own home, with an object that had proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that it was utterly inescapable. The faint, chilling melody of the music box seemed to mock his despair, a triumphant anthem of his utter helplessness. Michael closed his eyes, pressing his hands against his ears, but the tune and the terrifying knowledge it brought resonated deep within his bones. He was no longer just scared. He was utterly, irrevocably broken. And the game he knew had only just begun. The world tilted. David's knees buckled and he slumped to the floor. the rough carpet scratching his cheek. The melody, that sickeningly sweet, deceptively innocent melody, had finally ceased, but its echo reverberated in the hollow chambers of his skull. It wasn't just a tune. It was a code, a language he now understood on a visceral level, and the knowledge it had imparted. It was a poison, seeping into every neuron, staining every thought. He knew what it was, what he was. The object, a small, intricately carved wooden music box, sat innocently on the coffee table, its polished surface reflecting the dim light of the living room lamp. It looked harmless, almost beautiful, a relic from a bygone era. But David now saw it for what it truly was, a cage. Not for something within it, but a cage it had built around him. A cold, clammy sweat slicked his skin. His breath hitched, ragged and shallow. He tried to push himself up, to crawl away, to put distance between himself and the malevolent artifact, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. Every muscle screamed in protest, not from physical exertion, but from the sheer terror that had seized his very being. He had to get rid of it. He had to. The thought was a desperate, primal scream in his mind. He finally managed to scramble to his feet, his body trembling uncontrollably. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, were fixed on the music box. It seemed to pulse, to hum with an unseen energy, though it remained perfectly still. He lunged for it, his hands shaking so violently he almost missed. His fingers closed around the cool, smooth wood. Felt wrong. Not just cold, but imbued with a strange, stagnant warmth, like something that had been alive and then died, but had never truly left. He lifted it, intending to hurl it against the wall, to smash it into 1,000 splinters, to eradicate its existence from his life. But then a whisper. Not a sound, not really, but an insidious thought that slithered into his mind, clear as if someone had spoken directly into his ear. You can't. His arm froze, poised in midair. A wave of nausea washed over him, bile rising in his throat. He stared at the music box, its tiny brass latch seeming to glint mockingly. The whisper intensified, growing into a silent chorus of voices, all echoing the same sentiment. Asterisk, you can't. You belong to us now. Asterisk. His grip slackened. The music box slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the soft carpet. It didn't break. It didn't even seem to suffer a scratch. It simply lay there, defiant, unyielding. David backed away, stumbling over his own feet until he hit the wall, sliding down to the floor once more. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, a hidden door, anything that could sever the invisible tether that now bound him to this cursed object. But there was nothing. Just his familiar living room, now transformed into a prison cell. He spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, staring at the music box. Sleep was an impossible luxury. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe. Every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps approaching. He heard the faint, distant strains of the melody, always just at the edge of hearing. A phantom tune that played exclusively for him, a constant reminder of his new horrifying reality. When the first rays of dawn finally pierced through the blinds, painting the room in a weak, gray light, David felt no relief. The light only served to highlight the music box, making it appear even more innocuous, more dangerous in its unassuming perfection. He was exhausted, his mind a chaotic storm of fear and despair, yet intensely awake. He called in sick to work, muttering something about a stomach bug. His boss, Michael, sounded sympathetic enough, but David knew his voice was thin, reedy, betraying his shattered state. He couldn't face the outside world, not when his own internal world had been irrevocably shattered. His phone rang an hour later. It was Jessica, his closest friend, her voice bright and cheerful. "Hey stranger, you still alive? Haven't heard from you since Tuesday. Everything okay?" David swallowed, his throat dry and constricted. "Yeah, Jess. Just not feeling great. Caught something." He tried to sound normal, but the words felt like sandpaper in his mouth. "Oh, bummer. Anything I can do? Bring over some soup? A movie marathon?" Her concern was genuine. A lifeline he desperately wanted to grab but couldn't. How could he explain? How could he tell her that a simple antique music box had revealed a truth so terrifying it had broken him? She'd think he was insane. He felt insane. No, I'm good," he lied, forcing a weak chuckle. "Just need to sleep it off. Thanks, though." He hung up, the familiar sound of her voice only deepening his isolation. He was truly alone in this. His gaze drifted back to the music box. It was still on the carpet, exactly where it had fallen. He felt a perverse urge to understand it, to delve into its history, to find the source of its malevolence. Perhaps if he understood it, he could fight it. Or more likely, he could find a way to sever his connection, to free himself from its grasp. He carefully approached it, his movements slow, deliberate, as if stalking a venomous snake. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings of vines and grotesque, smiling faces. He noticed a faint, almost invisible inscription on the bottom, obscured by years of grime and wear. He squinted, trying to decipher the faded script. It wasn't English. It looked ancient, almost runic. A sudden sharp pain flared in his palm, as if a tiny invisible splinter had pierced his skin. He gasped, dropping the box onto the coffee table with a thud. He examined his hand. Nothing. No splinter, no mark, just a residual ache that quickly faded. But the sensation had been undeniably real. A warning. He grabbed his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He typed in keywords: antique music box, haunted objects, ancient carvings, cursed artifacts. He spent hours poring over forums, historical archives, obscure paranormal websites. Most of it was sensationalized nonsense, ghost stories and urban legends. But then he found something. A small forgotten blog post from an amateur historian, buried deep within a forgotten corner of the internet. The post detailed a collection of artifacts, all linked by a recurring symbol. A stylized, interlocking knot pattern, eerily similar to one of the carvings on his music box. The author, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Reed, had written about these objects as conduits, objects designed to bridge realms to house entities. His blood ran cold. Conduits. The word echoed the terrifying knowledge the tune had imparted. It wasn't just haunted, it was a vessel. And the entity it housed wasn't just in the box. It was now woven into him. The blog post went on to describe the legend surrounding these conduits. They weren't merely passive objects. They were said to actively seek out individuals, hosts, whose unique energetic signature aligned with the entity's needs. Once a connection was established, it was unbreakable. The host would become a living anchor, a gateway. And the entity once anchored could begin to manifest, to influence, to consume. David's breath hitched. Consume. That was the knowledge. That was the game. He wasn't just cursed, he was chosen. He was the next meal. He scrolled down further, searching for any mention of how to break the connection, how to destroy a conduit. But the blog post ended abruptly mid-sentence, almost as if the author had been interrupted. The last entry was dated nearly 10 years ago. Attempts to find Dr. Evelyn Reed online yielded no results. She had vanished. A chilling thought struck him. Had she gotten too close? Had she become a host herself? He felt a profound sense of despair. There was no escape. The music box had chosen him, and now it was slowly, meticulously, devouring him from the inside out. He could feel it. A subtle shift in his perception, a growing detachment from his own emotions, a creeping sense of otherness. Suddenly, a faint, metallic clicking sound emanated from the coffee table. David flinched, his head snapping up. The music box. The small brass latch, which had been closed, was now slowly, almost imperceptibly, unhooking itself. His heart hammered against his ribs. He watched, transfixed, as the latch clicked open. Then the lid, with an agonizingly slow creak, began to lift. It wasn't being touched. There was no breeze, no vibration. It was opening on its own. A wave of icy dread washed over him. This wasn't just a haunted object. This was an intelligent, malevolent force, toying with him, demonstrating its power. The lid opened fully, revealing the empty, velvet-lined interior. But it wasn't empty. A faint, ethereal mist, shimmering with an almost imperceptible indigo hue, began to swirl within. It pulsed gently like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. And then from within the swirling mist, a sound began to emanate. Not the familiar, sickeningly sweet tune, but something else. A low guttural hum. It wasn't a melody, but a vibration deep and resonant that made the very air in the room thrum. It felt ancient, primordial, a sound that bypassed his ears and vibrated directly against his bone marrow. The hum intensified, growing louder, more insistent. And with it, the mist began to coalesce, to thicken, taking on a form. A vague, shadowy outline, barely discernible, but undeniably present. It stretched, it pulsed, it yearned. David felt a cold, sharp tendril of fear curl around his spine. This was it. This was the entity. And it was no longer content to remain contained within its wooden prison. It was reaching out, reaching for him. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his constricted throat. His muscles locked, his body frozen in a tableau of pure terror. The shadowy form in the music box grew larger, its edges becoming sharper, more defined. He could almost make out eyes, two pinpricks of icy light, staring directly at him. The hum reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that filled his mind, drowning out all other thought. And then a voice, not spoken aloud, but reverberating directly in his consciousness, cold and ancient, yet perfectly clear. Asterisk, you are mine, David. Asterisk. The words were a final crushing blow. He wasn't just a host, he was a possession. And the game, he realized with a horrifying certainty, was not just about survival. It was about ownership. The music box wasn't just containing something. It was collecting something. And he was its latest acquisition. His world, his identity, his very soul was being systematically dismantled piece by agonizing piece. And the entity, now fully awake, was ready to claim its prize. The prize wasn't gold or power or adoration. It was something far more intimate, more insidious. The prize was Michael himself. The first few days were a blur of disquiet. Michael found himself staring at the antique compass, a cold weight in his palm, a growing void in his chest. He'd pick it up, feel a faint humming beneath his fingers, and then a moment later, he'd be standing in his living room, confused, the compass back on the mantelpiece. He'd try to remember picking it up, try to remember setting it down, but the moments were gone like pages ripped from a book. He checked the time, surprised to find hours had passed, hours he couldn't account for, during which he felt a strange, detached calm, almost as if he hadn't been present in his own body. Then came the dreams. Not typical nightmares, but fragmented echoes of his past, distorted and unsettling. He'd dream of his childhood home, but the walls would be shifting, the furniture melting, his parents' faces obscured by shadow. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental was being altered within him. He started forgetting small things, where he put his keys, what he had for breakfast, the name of a distant relative. At first, he dismissed it as stress, a symptom of his demanding job. But the forgetfulness began to escalate. It wasn't just memories disappearing. It was as if the context of those memories was being erased. He looked at old photographs, pictures of himself with his longtime girlfriend, Sarah, laughing on a beach, and felt a strange disconnect. He knew it was him, he knew it was Sarah, he could intellectually recall the event, but the emotional resonance, the warmth, the joy, the feeling of being there was gone. It was like reading a factual account of someone else's life. Sarah noticed. She was the first to truly see the cracks forming in Michael's carefully constructed reality. He'd forget plans they'd made, or repeat stories he'd told her just days before. He'd look at her sometimes with an unsettling blankness in his eyes, as if trying to place her. "Michael, are you okay?" she'd ask, her brow furrowed with concern. "You seem distant." He'd force a smile, a hollow mask he was becoming adept at wearing. "Just tired, honey. Work's been brutal." But it wasn't work. It was the compass. He knew it deep down in the shrinking core of his consciousness that still clung to reason. Every time he felt that inexplicable pull towards it, every time he touched its cold, metallic surface, another piece of him seemed to detach, to float away into an unseen current. One evening, Sarah found him in the living room, staring intently at the compass on the mantelpiece. He hadn't noticed her enter. His gaze was fixed, unblinking, his body rigid. "Michael," she said softly, touching his arm. He flinched, startled, his eyes wide and disoriented. "Sarah? What are you doing here?" Her hand dropped, her face paling. "Michael, I live here. We live here. Are you all right?" He looked around the familiar room, then back at her, a flicker of recognition returning, quickly followed by a profound shame. "Right. Of course. Sorry, I just got lost in thought." But he knew it was more than that. He had genuinely, for a terrifying moment, forgotten where he was, forgotten her. The entity wasn't just erasing memories. It was erasing his sense of self. He started to lose track of his own preferences, his own opinions. Someone would ask him what he wanted for dinner, and he'd draw a blank. His favorite band, his preferred coffee, the color he loved. These small, defining details of his personality were becoming elusive, ghostly whispers in a mind that was growing steadily quieter. He tried to fight it. He tried to ignore the compass to avoid looking at it. But its presence was a constant thrum beneath the surface of his awareness, a magnetic north pulling him back, always back. He'd find himself gravitating towards the living room, his gaze drawn to the mantelpiece, his hand reaching out almost involuntarily. It was a compulsion, a silent command that bypassed his will. One morning he woke up with a jolt, a name on his lips. David. David, his best friend since college. He wanted to call him, to talk to him, to confide in him about the terrifying changes. He reached for his phone but then paused. What was David's last name? Where did he work? What was his wife's name? The details, once so vivid, were now shrouded in fog. He could picture David's face, hear his laugh, but the concrete facts, the anchors of their friendship, were dissolving. A cold dread seeped into his bones. This wasn't just forgetting, this was unmaking. He looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His eyes seemed different, hollower, older, yet also strangely detached, as if the person looking back wasn't quite him. He brushed his teeth, ran a hand through his hair, performed the routine motions, but it felt like watching a stranger go through the motions. His own face was becoming a mask of fading familiarity. The entity's influence wasn't confined to his mind. Strange occurrences began in the house. Objects would move. He'd leave his keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them later in his shoe. A book he was reading would disappear from his nightstand, reappearing days later on a shelf in the den, open to a random page. Sarah dismissed it as him being forgetful, or perhaps even playing harmless pranks. But Michael knew better. He felt a subtle shift in the house's atmosphere, a growing chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was as if the house itself was subtly reordering itself, reflecting the chaos within his mind, or perhaps becoming an extension of the object's will. He started to hear things. Faint whispers at the edge of his hearing, just beyond comprehension. They sounded like a chorus of voices, echoing from a great distance, sometimes familiar, sometimes utterly alien. He'd whip his head around, straining to catch a word, but they would always recede, leaving only the mundane sounds of the house. Were they the voices of the entity's previous acquisitions? The lost echoes of other souls it had consumed? The thought sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. One particularly harrowing night, he woke up to find himself standing in the living room, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the windows. The compass was in his hand. He had no memory of getting out of bed, of walking to the living room, of picking up the object. He just was there, holding it, his fingers tracing its smooth, cold surface. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet calm that was deeply unsettling. It wasn't his peace. It was an imposed tranquility, a synthetic absence of fear, and it terrified him more than any nightmare. He tried to throw the compass. He lifted his arm, intending to hurl it across the room, to shatter it, to be rid of it forever. But his arm wouldn't obey. It felt heavy, leaden, as if an invisible force was holding it captive. He struggled, muscles straining, but the compass remained firmly in his grasp. A wave of exhaustion washed over him, a profound weariness that settled deep into his bones. He slumped onto the sofa, the compass still clutched in his hand, and drifted into a fitful, dreamless sleep. When he awoke hours later, the compass was back on the mantelpiece. He was still on the sofa, his body aching, his mind a jumble of confusion and fear. He felt weaker, somehow, as if the struggle had drained him not just physically but spiritually. This was the entity's true power. Not just to take but to control, to subtly manipulate his actions, to guide him, to prevent him from resisting. He was a puppet whose strings were slowly, meticulously being tightened. His free will was eroding, replaced by an insidious compliance. He began to notice a pattern. Every time he touched the compass, or even just stared at it for too long, a significant memory would vanish. Not just the emotional context, but the memory itself. His first kiss with Sarah, the day he graduated college, the moment he landed his dream job. These foundational moments, the pillars of his identity, were being systematically dismantled, brick by agonizing brick. The void within him grew, a chilling emptiness where his past used to be. He was becoming a blank slate, a vessel waiting to be filled. But with what? The entity wasn't just collecting his memories. It was collecting his essence. It was stripping away the unique tapestry of experiences, emotions, and decisions that made him Michael. And in its place, it was leaving nothing but a quiet, compliant emptiness. Sarah grew increasingly alarmed. She started keeping a journal, documenting Michael's changes, the forgotten conversations, the vacant stares. She saw the fear in his eyes, buried beneath the growing apathy. She knew something was terribly wrong, something far beyond stress or forgetfulness. She tried to talk to him, to get him to see a doctor, a therapist. "Michael, please," she pleaded one evening, holding his hands, trying to meet his gaze. "You're not yourself. What's happening to you?" He looked at her, his eyes distant, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "I'm fine, Sarah. I'm becoming clearer." Her blood ran cold. "Clearer?" He sounded like a stranger, his voice devoid of its usual warmth, carrying an eerie, detached calm. He wasn't becoming clearer. He was becoming hollow. He was becoming a shell. And the entity, now fully awake, its collection nearly complete, was ready to step into the void. It was ready to fully inhabit its new prize. He was ready to fully inhabit its new prize. Emily didn't notice it at first. Not really. The change in Michael was insidious, a slow, creeping fog that settled over him like a permanent shadow. He'd always been a man of routines, a creature of habit, and while his recent obsession with the antique box had been out of character, she'd attributed it to a new hobby, a phase. Men, she'd reasoned, sometimes found strange passions. But as days bled into weeks, the hobby morphed into something darker, something profoundly unsettling. His eyes, once warm and expressive, now held a disturbing flatness, like two polished stones reflecting only the barest flicker of light. When he looked at her, it wasn't him looking. It was as if a curtain had been drawn behind his pupils, obscuring the familiar soul she'd known for 15 years. He still went to work, still ate dinner, still sat on the couch beside her, but the essence of Michael, the vibrant, witty, sometimes grumpy but always present man, was fading, becoming translucent. "Michael?" she'd asked one evening, reaching for his hand, which lay strangely cold and inert on the armrest. "Are you all right? You seem distant." He turned his head slowly, his gaze drifting over her face without truly seeing her. "I'm fine, Emily," he'd murmured, his voice a low, even monotone she barely recognized. "Just thinking." Thinking about what? She wanted to ask, but the words caught in her throat. There was an invisible wall between them, a barrier of ice. He spent hours in his study, the door often ajar, but if she peered in, he wasn't doing anything. He would just be sitting there, staring at the polished surface of the antique box, his fingers occasionally tracing its intricate carvings. Sometimes she'd hear him whisper, a low guttural murmur that sounded less like conversation and more like a dry, rustling wind. The house itself began to feel different. A pervasive chill settled in, not just the kind that came from an open window, but a deep, bone-aching cold that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Objects would shift. A book she'd left on the coffee table would be on the floor. A teacup she'd just placed in the sink would be back on the counter, always in places Michael couldn't have reached without her noticing. She'd dismiss it as forgetfulness, or perhaps the house settling, but a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. One night, she woke to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps moving through the hallway. Her heart pounded. Michael usually slept like a log. She nudged him, but his side of the bed was empty. Panic flared. She grabbed her phone, its flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, and crept out of the bedroom. The footsteps led her to the study. The door was wide open. Michael stood in the center of the room, not facing the box, but facing the open window, his back to her. The window was usually locked, but now it was unlatched, letting in a gust of cold, damp night air. His silhouette was stark against the faint moonlight, rigid and unervingly still. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't move. She took another step, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor. "What are you doing? It's freezing in here." Slowly, deliberately, he turned. His face was obscured by shadow, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. And then he smiled. It wasn't Michael's smile. Michael's smile was crooked, a little shy, crinkling the corners of his eyes. This smile was wide, slow, stretching his lips into an unnatural grimace that showed too much gum, too many teeth. It was a predatory smile, devoid of humor or warmth, a grotesque parody of human expression. "Just enjoying the night air, Emily," he said, his voice still that flat monotone, but now with an underlying resonance, a subtle vibration that seemed to tickle her eardrums, a sound that felt ancient and wrong. Her breath hitched. She took an involuntary step back. You never do that." The smile widened. "There are many things I never did before." His head tilted slightly, a movement too precise, too mechanical. "But now, I am learning." A shiver, colder than any draft, ran down her spine. This wasn't Michael. This was something else wearing his skin. She felt a primal urge to scream, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Her eyes darted to the antique box on the desk, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It seemed to pulse with a silent energy, a gravitational pull that drew all the shadows towards it. "What are you talking about?" she forced out, trying to sound normal, trying to reason with whatever stood before her. He took a step towards her and she flinched. "I am talking about awakening, about freedom, about a new beginning." The words were calm, almost poetic, but delivered with such an absolute lack of human emotion that they were terrifying. She backed away further, bumping into the doorframe. "Michael, stop it. You're scaring me." He paused, his head cocked again. "Scaring you?" The smile faded, replaced by that chillingly blank expression. "Why would I scare you, Emily? I am your husband." The way he said husband was like a child repeating a word they didn't understand, mimicking the sound without grasping its meaning. It was a performance, a facade. "No," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "No, you're not. You're not Michael." A flicker of something crossed his face then, a swift shadow that might have been annoyance, or perhaps a predatory impatience. "Perhaps you are right," he said, the monotone voice dropping slightly, becoming harder, colder. "Perhaps I am not the Michael you remember, but I am the Michael who is here now, and I am growing." He took another step, and Emily turned and fled. She ran back to the bedroom, her heart hammering against her ribs, slammed the door shut, and fumbled for the lock. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely turn the small metal knob. She pressed her back against the door, gasping for breath, listening. Silence. Only the frantic thumping of her own heart filled her ears. She waited, terrified, for footsteps, for a knock, for that unnatural voice to call her name. But nothing came. She didn't sleep that night. She sat huddled in a corner of the bed, clutching her knees, watching the door, praying for the dawn. When the first weak rays of sun finally pierced the blinds, washing the room in a pale gray light, she felt a sliver of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a cold dread. What was she going to do? The next morning, Michael was at the breakfast table, seemingly normal. He poured himself coffee, read the newspaper. He even offered her a half-smile, the one she knew. But when she looked into his eyes, they were still flat, still devoid of the spark that was Michael. It was a perfect imitation, a puppet master pulling strings with exquisite precision. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice now sounding more like her husband's, though still missing that certain timbre, that underlying warmth. She stared at him, her mind reeling. Had she imagined it? The smile, the voice, the chilling pronouncements? No, it had been too real. I heard you in the study last night," she ventured, her voice barely a whisper. "By the window." He lowered the newspaper, his brow furrowing slightly, a perfect imitation of concern. "The study? What are you talking about, Emily? I was asleep the whole night. Must have been a dream." His denial was so absolute, so convincing, it almost made her doubt herself. But she couldn't. She remembered the cold, the words, the terrifying smile. "No, Michael," she said, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a surge of defiant fear. "It wasn't a dream. You were there. And you said you were growing." His expression remained unreadable for a moment. Then a slow, almost imperceptible shift occurred. The corners of his lips twitched, just slightly, and a cold, ancient amusement seemed to emanate from him, chilling her to the core. "Perhaps you should get more sleep, dear," he said, his voice smooth, calm, but with an underlying current that made her skin crawl. "Dreams can be very vivid." He picked up his newspaper again, effectively ending the conversation. Emily knew then. She knew Michael was gone. Or at least he was deeply, horrifyingly buried. Whatever had taken root in him, whatever had been drawn from that ancient, terrible box, was now fully in control. It was inhabiting him, learning him, perfecting its mimicry. And it was dangerous. Her gaze fell on the antique box, sitting innocently on the study desk, visible through the open doorway. Its dark would seem to absorb the morning light, radiating an unnatural cold. It was the source. It had to be. She had to get rid of it. But how? And what would happen if she did? What would happen to Michael? The entity within Michael seemed to sense her thoughts, or perhaps it merely reacted to her intense stare. Michael's head, still behind the newspaper, tilted just slightly in her direction. She couldn't see his eyes, but she felt them. Felt the immense, ancient presence behind them, watching her, calculating. A sudden sharp crack echoed from the living room. The large antique mirror, a family heirloom, had split down the middle, a jagged fissure running from top to bottom, as if struck by an invisible force. Emily gasped, her eyes wide with terror. Michael slowly lowered his newspaper. He looked at the shattered mirror, then back at Emily, that faint, chilling amusement playing on his lips again. "Accidents happen, Emily," he said, his voice a silky whisper that was both Michael's and utterly alien, "especially when things resist." And for the first time, Emily understood. The entity wasn't just possessing Michael. It was making its presence known, asserting its power, warning her. It was telling her that it was here, fully present, fully awake. And it was telling her that Michael was merely its vessel, its new prize, and it would not be contained. Not by her, not by anyone, and certainly not by a mere house or a fragile human will. It was ready to move, ready to act. And she, Emily, was directly in its way. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on Emily with an invisible, suffocating weight. The words echoed, not just in her ears but deep within her bones. Michael was merely its vessel, its new prize. It would not be contained. Not by her, not by anyone. The entity's presence swelled, a cold, predatory force that seemed to fill every corner of the house, every creak of the floorboards, every shadow dancing in the dim light. Michael stood before her, his eyes still holding that alien, chilling gleam, his lips curled in a mockery of a smile. He was a statue of menace, yet she could feel the immense, coiled power radiating from him, a power that was no longer dormant. It was ready. A jolt of primal terror shot through Emily, freezing her in place. This wasn't some shadowy figure in the corner, some fleeting whisper. This was a direct, undeniable confrontation with something ancient and malevolent, something that had claimed her husband and was now openly defying her. Her mind screamed, a cacophony of fear and disbelief, but a deeper, more profound instinct began to stir within her. It was the instinct of a wife, a mother, a protector. This was her Michael, no matter how distorted, no matter how possessed. She would not abandon him. She would not let this thing win. Before she could even formulate a coherent thought, the entity began to move. Michael's body, stiff and unnatural, turned towards the hallway, towards the front door. It wasn't a walk, not truly. It was a glide, disturbingly smooth, as if his feet barely touched the floor. Each step was deliberate, heavy with an unseen purpose. The house itself seemed to groan in protest, or perhaps in anticipation. A low guttural hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of her home. "No!" Emily's voice was a ragged gasp, a desperate plea torn from her throat. She lunged forward, her arms outstretched, intending to grab Michael, to pull him back, to wrestle him out of this nightmare. But as she reached him, a sudden brutal force slammed into her. Not a physical blow, but an invisible wall of pure, concentrated energy. She stumbled backward, crashing into the heavy oak dresser behind her, the impact jarring her teeth and sending a sharp pain through her lower back. A collection of porcelain figures, cherished keepsakes from her grandmother, rattled precariously before toppling and shattering on the floor, their delicate forms reduced to glittering shards. Emily cried out, but the sound was swallowed by a sudden, deafening crescendo of noise. The lights in the house flickered wildly, strobing from blinding brilliance to utter darkness, casting grotesque, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and contort. The windows rattled violently in their frames, as if an unseen gale was battering them from the outside, even though the night air beyond them was perfectly still. Doors throughout the house began to slam shut, one after another, a terrifying drumbeat echoing through the sudden, eerie silence between the light flashes. Each slam was punctuated by a shrill, discordant note that seemed to emanate from the living room, from the antique music box itself. The entity, still in Michael's form, paid her no mind. It continued its slow, inexorable progress towards the front door, its path unhindered by the chaos it was unleashing. It was a force of nature, an unstoppable tide, and Emily was merely a pebble in its way. She pushed herself up, adrenaline coursing through her veins, overriding the throbbing pain in her back. Her eyes wide with terror and a fierce resolve, fixated on Michael's retreating back. This wasn't just about saving him from some dark influence. It was about preventing this thing from escaping, from taking its malevolence beyond the walls of her home. The title of the story, the whispered warnings, the chilling premonitions, they all coalesced into a single terrifying truth. This object, this entity, truly would not be contained. It was breaking free. She scrambled after him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The air grew colder with every step Michael took, a biting, unnatural chill that seemed to suck the warmth from her body and the hope from her soul. The hum intensified, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated up from the floor, through her feet, and into her very core, making her teeth ache. She could feel the house itself groaning, protesting. It was as if the entity was tearing a hole in the fabric of reality, bending the very structure of her home to its will. As Michael reached the front door, the antique music box in the living room unleashed a final piercing shriek of sound, a cacophony of twisted notes that seemed to tear at the air. Then, with a sudden sickening crack, the music box itself exploded. Splinters of wood, brass gears, and delicate springs flew through the air, embedding themselves in the nearby wall, narrowly missing Emily as she rounded the corner. A cloud of fine, glittering dust, smelling faintly of old wood and something metallic and acrid, hung in the air where the object had once sat. The entity had destroyed its own vessel, its anchor perhaps to this house, making its escape even more imminent. It was shedding its skin, preparing for a grander stage. The front door, solid oak and locked from the inside, shuddered violently. The deadbolt mechanism groaned, and then, with a sound like a gunshot, the entire lock assembly ripped itself from the doorframe, sending splinters of wood flying. The door swung inward with an eerie slowness, revealing the dark, silent street outside. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, and the familiar neighborhood suddenly looked alien, menacing. "No, Michael, please," Emily cried, her voice cracking with desperation. She reached him just as he was about to step over the threshold. This time she didn't hesitate. With a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed, she wrapped her arms around his waist, digging her heels in, trying to pull him back. His body was rigid, cold, almost inhumanly heavy. It was like trying to stop a runaway train. The entity within him paused, its progress halted for a fleeting moment. A low, menacing growl rumbled deep in Michael's chest, a sound that was utterly foreign, devoid of any human warmth. Then, slowly, with an agonizing deliberateness, Michael's head turned. His eyes, those chilling, glowing orbs, met hers. There was no recognition, no flicker of the man she loved, only an ancient, boundless rage. "You're in the way," the entity hissed, the words not truly spoken, but scraping through Michael's throat like stones grinding together. The sound was amplified, echoing not just from his mouth, but seemingly from the very air around them. It was a voice that promised oblivion, a voice that had witnessed centuries of human folly, and now sought to inflict its own brand of terror. As it spoke, the pressure around Emily intensified. It was as if the air itself was trying to crush her. Her arms, still wrapped around Michael, began to tremble uncontrollably. She could feel her grip weakening, her muscles screaming in protest. The entity was pushing back, not with a physical shove, but with an immense, unseen force that threatened to buckle her knees and rip her arms from their sockets. She felt a sharp, searing pain in her wrists, as if invisible chains were tightening around them. She looked into those horrifying eyes, and for a split second she saw it. Not the entity, not the malevolence, but a flash of something else, something deep within the glowing abyss. A flicker of fear, a silent plea, a desperate cry for help. It was Michael, her Michael, trapped, screaming, fighting against the monster that held him captive. He was there, buried beneath layers of darkness, and for that brief, agonizing moment, he was begging her. That single fleeting glimpse of her husband, her true love, ignited a new fire in Emily. It wasn't just fear or desperation anymore. It was a fierce, protective love, a burning resolve to save him, no matter the cost. "No!" she screamed again, her voice raw, defiant. "You won't have him." "You won't escape." The entity recoiled slightly, a subtle shift in its immense pressure, as if surprised by her renewed strength, by the sheer force of her will. But the pause was momentary. Its anger, its intent was too great. The house began to shake violently, the entire structure groaning and creaking as if it were about to collapse. Plaster rained down from the ceiling, dust motes danced in the flickering light, and a massive crack snaked its way up the wall beside the front door, widening with terrifying speed. The entity was not merely trying to leave, it was tearing its way out, ripping a hole in reality itself, taking the very fabric of the house with it if necessary. Emily felt herself being lifted, not by Michael's hands, but by the invisible force that surrounded him. Her feet left the ground, and she was slammed against the door frame, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She gasped for air, her vision blurring, but she refused to let go. Her fingers, despite the pain, dug deeper into Michael's clothes, clinging to him like a limpet. She knew with a horrifying certainty that if she let go now, she would lose him forever. And this thing, whatever it was, would be unleashed upon the world. The consequences were unimaginable. Through her fading vision, she saw Michael, or rather, the entity controlling him, raise an arm. Not to strike her, but to point. Not at her, but at something beyond the open door. Out into the dark, unsuspecting street. It was a gesture of triumph, of imminent freedom. The hum intensified to a deafening roar. The house trembled violently, and Emily felt the last fragments of her strength beginning to ebb away. She was losing. This thing was too powerful. It was going to break free, and Michael would be its first conquest in a world unaware of the horror about to descend. The entity within Michael was almost out, its grip on him absolute, and its purpose terrifyingly clear. Emily was the only thing left, a fragile, broken barrier between it and the unsuspecting world, and it was about to shatter her. The air in the containment chamber, already frigid, plummeted to an unbearable chill. Emily's breath plumed in front of her, her lungs burning with each shallow inhale. Michael, or what was left of him, stood before her, his eyes now twin abysses of swirling, malevolent energy. The familiar warmth of his gaze was gone, replaced by an ancient, predatory darkness that seemed to swallow the very light in the room. His skin, once pale, was now stretched taut over sharpened angles, a grotesque caricature of the man she knew. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the floor, rising in intensity until it felt like her very bones were rattling. The containment box, Michael's obsession and their shared nightmare, pulsed with an angry crimson light. It wasn't just a glow. It was a rhythmic, almost organic throb, mirroring the frantic beat of Emily's own heart. The entity was not merely escaping Michael. It was consuming him, using his form as a temporary gateway, a launching pad into their reality. Emily stumbled back, her hand instinctively going to the small, ornate key she still clutched. It felt insignificant, a child's toy against the monumental force now coalescing before her. The entity, through Michael's twisted mouth, didn't speak with words, but with a chorus of ancient whispers that clawed at the edges of her sanity. It was a language of pure malice, of forgotten pain, promising an eternity of suffering. She felt its tendrils probing her mind, seeking weaknesses, trying to unravel her resolve, to break her spirit before it even touched her. "You won't win," Emily choked out, her voice a reedy whisper against the entity's deafening presence. She knew it was a lie, a desperate plea to herself, because everything within her screamed that it already had. Michael's form began to distort further, elongating, twisting, his limbs stretching impossibly. Shadows danced around him, not cast by light, but emanating from him, deepening the gloom in the chamber until it felt like they were plunged into the deepest abyss. The temperature dropped again, biting and sharp, freezing the very air in her throat. Suddenly, a violent tremor shook the entire facility. Alarms, which had been silenced by the entity's growing power, shrieked back to life, their urgent blare a stark contrast to the oppressive silence the entity had imposed. The emergency lights flickered, casting strobe-like shadows across the horror unfolding. Emily realized with a sickening lurch that the containment field, the last bastion of their defense, was failing. The entity wasn't just breaking out of Michael. It was breaking out of everything. Through the chaos, a new voice, strained but resolute, cut through the cacophony. "Emily, the core readings. It's accelerating." It was David, Michael's former colleague, a man whose gentle demeanor belied a keen scientific mind. He burst into the chamber, his face pale with fear, but his eyes fixed on the pulsing containment box. He carried a heavy, reinforced briefcase, which he slammed onto a nearby console, fumbling with its latches. "The core of what, David?" Emily shouted back, her gaze torn between the monstrous figure that was Michael and the frantic scientist. "The object. It's not just a prison, Emily. It's a conduit. The entity is drawing power directly from it, amplifying itself with every passing second," David yelled, pulling out a complex device that looked like a portable scanner and a series of thick, insulated cables. Michael wasn't just possessed. He was being used as a bridge. The entity wants to fully manifest, to tear through into our world using the object's energy as its anchor. The truth hit Emily with the force of a physical blow. Michael hadn't just stumbled upon a haunted artifact. He had become an unwitting participant in a ritual, a sacrifice in the entity's grand escape plan. Her heart ached with a grief so profound it threatened to buckle her knees. Michael, her brilliant, curious Michael, had been consumed by the very mystery he sought to unravel. As David frantically tried to connect his device to the failing containment console, the entity, through Michael's form, let out a sound that wasn't a scream, but a tearing of reality itself. The air shimmered, distorting the very walls of the chamber. Cracks spiderwebbed across the reinforced glass of the observation window, and dust rained down from the ceiling. The entity was no longer content to merely exist within Michael. It was manifesting around him, a swirling vortex of shadow and despair. "The key, Emily. What did Michael tell you about the key?" David cried, not looking up from his desperate work. "There's a diagram in his journal, a sequence. He thought it was about disarming the object, but what if it's about redirecting it? About severing the connection?" Emily looked down at the ornate key in her hand. It wasn't just a key. It was intricately carved with symbols that now seemed terrifyingly familiar from Michael's cryptic notes. She remembered his frantic sketches, the complex patterns he'd been so obsessed with, the ones she dismissed as ramblings. He had been trying to tell her, to warn her, to give her a chance. He said it opens the way, but also locks it," Emily stammered, her mind racing, trying to piece together fragments of conversations, late-night ramblings, and Michael's desperate warnings. "He said it was the final safeguard, but only if used correctly, in the moment of ultimate breach." The entity heard her. Its head, still vaguely Michael's, snapped towards her, an impossible rotation that made her stomach churn. The ancient whispers intensified, now laced with a chilling amusement, a promise of swift and agonizing destruction. It knew she was a threat, a tiny spark of defiance against its impending triumph. "It's trying to sever the link to the object, Emily," David yelled, finally looking up, his eyes wide with terror. "It's trying to completely integrate Michael's life force with the object's power. If it succeeds, it will be unstoppable. The key. It's the only way to disrupt that connection, to force it back." The containment box pulsed violently, its crimson light now blinding. The entity, in Michael's monstrous form, began to levitate, rising slowly, majestically towards the ceiling. Its shadow spread, engulfing everything, making the chamber a cavern of pure darkness save for the object's furious glow. Its power was absolute, its victory inevitable. Emily knew what she had to do. The key wasn't just for opening, it was for closing, for containing. But to do so, she would have to get impossibly close to the entity, to the very heart of the storm. And she would have to use the key on the object, the source of its power, which was now radiating an unbearable heat and a palpable malevolence. With a primal scream that was more defiance than fear, Emily charged. The entity, sensing her desperate move, let out another deafening roar, and a wave of pure psychic force slammed into her, throwing her backward. She hit the cold metal floor with a sickening thud, the breath knocked from her lungs, her vision blurring. The key, her only hope, clattered across the floor, sliding precariously close to the edge of an open service hatch. "No!" David screamed, abandoning his console to scramble towards her. But it was too late. The entity was fully formed, a towering, amorphous being of shadows and raw energy, its connection to the containment box complete. Michael's face, a final, despairing image, flickered within its swirling mass for a fleeting second, a silent scream of agony and farewell, before being utterly consumed. The world outside the chamber began to tremble, the very foundations of reality starting to fray under the entity's colossal power. Emily lay helpless, watching in horror as the ancient evil began its final terrifying ascent, its purpose no longer just clear, but excruciatingly manifest. Its first taste of freedom after eons of confinement was about to descend upon a world utterly unprepared. The world, formerly a solid, predictable tapestry of light and shadow, sound and silence, tore itself apart at the seams. It wasn't an explosion, not in the conventional sense, but a rupture in the very fabric of existence. The air itself became a screaming cacophony of impossible frequencies, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the bone, a resonance that threatened to shatter every internal organ. Colors warped and bled, the vibrant hues of the lab dissolving into a swirling vortex of sickening greens, bruised purples, and an absolute, terrifying black that swallowed light without reflection. Michael gasped, not for air, but against the crushing pressure that bore down on him, a weight not of gravity but of pure, unadulterated dread. His mind, once a fortress of logical thought, was under siege. Visions flashed before his eyes. His deepest failures, his most paralyzing fears, all magnified 1,000-fold, projected onto the swirling chaos around him. He saw the face of his estranged father, etched with disappointment, then the image morphed, becoming the entity itself, its features a shifting mosaic of cosmic horror. Jessica, her eyes wide and unfocused, stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream that never fully escaped. She saw patterns not just in the swirling energy but in the very air, in the microscopic particles dancing in the non-light. These weren't the orderly patterns she sought in her research. These were chaotic, destructive fractals, consuming and replicating, each new iteration more unstable than the last. She felt her consciousness stretching, thinning, threatening to snap as the entity's presence bombarded her with raw, unfiltered data, a language of existential unraveling. It was a symphony of cosmic destruction, and she was an unwilling listener, every note tearing at the delicate threads of her sanity. David cried out, a guttural sound of pure terror as he collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. The ancient texts, the warnings he had dismissed as mere superstition, were now manifesting before him. He saw the glyphs, not on parchment, but burning into his retina, scorching his internal vision. They pulsed with an infernal light, twisting into impossible shapes, whispering secrets of forgotten dimensions and the true, horrifying purpose of the artifact. He understood now with chilling clarity that the object wasn't just a prison. It was a key, a conduit, and they had just turned it in the lock. The entity wasn't just escaping. It was arriving, summoned by their unwitting hands. Emily, usually the most composed, stood frozen, her blood running cold as she felt a primal, instinctual terror unlike anything she had ever known. Her mind, usually so sharp and analytical, was reduced to a singular, desperate thought: run. But where? The walls of the lab, once reassuringly solid, now rippled like water, threatening to dissolve into the void. The very ground beneath her feet groaned, not from structural stress, but from an agony that felt ancient, profound, and utterly overwhelming. She felt a cold tendril of something unseen brush against her consciousness, a probing, alien intelligence that sought to peel back the layers of her being, to understand and then to consume. The artifact, the ornate box that had been the focal point of their dread, began to glow with an internal, malevolent light. It didn't explode. It simply unmade itself. The intricate carvings writhed and straightened, the gold and silver metals melted and reformed, not into liquid, but into shimmering ephemeral dust that drifted upwards, coalescing into a shimmering, indistinct cloud above them. This cloud pulsed, expanded, and then with a silent, terrifying implosion vanished. In its place where the box once stood was a void, a perfect sphere of absolute nothingness, drawing in light, sound, and even the air itself. It was a wound in reality, and from it the entity poured forth, not as a physical form, but as a cascade of pure, concentrated wrongness. A low hum began, emanating from the void, growing in intensity until it became a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very bones of the building, and then through the city and beyond. Lights flickered across the metropolis, then died, plunging entire districts into sudden, terrifying darkness. Car alarms wailed in unison, then abruptly ceased, leaving an unnatural, echoing silence in their wake, broken only by the persistent, unholy thrum. Michael, fighting through the hallucinatory onslaught, forced his eyes open, trying to focus on anything real. He saw Jessica, her face pale, her lips moving silently as if she was arguing with an invisible tormentor. He saw David rocking back and forth, muttering ancient phrases, He saw Emily, her eyes fixed on the void, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, reflecting the impossible colors of the unraveling world. We have to do something." Michael's voice was a ragged croak, barely audible above the internal scream of his own mind. He knew with a horrifying certainty that this wasn't just a localized event. The thrumming, the darkness, the sense of dread that permeated the very air. It was spreading. He could feel it, a cold tendril reaching out, touching every living thing, whispering of despair, of futility, of inevitable oblivion. Jessica, as if jolted by his voice, turned her head slowly. Her eyes, still wide and unfocused, now held a spark of something else, not hope, but a desperate analytical fury. "The pattern, it's not random," she choked out, her voice thin and reedy. "It's a language. Corrupted one. It's trying to rewrite everything." She pointed a trembling finger at the space where the artifact had been, at the shimmering, impossible void. The object, it wasn't just a prison, it was a filter. It contained the entity's true nature. Now it's gone. And the entity, it's pure, unadulterated chaos, but it has a logic. David, still on his knees, looked up, his face streaked with tears and sweat. The prophecy, the great unraveling, it spoke of the echo of the first breath. He whispered, his voice raspy. It said that if the vessel was broken, the echo would return, not as a conqueror but as a remover. It doesn't want to rule. It wants to erase. He pointed a trembling finger towards the spot where the artifact had been. The object, it contained a fragment of the original containment, a sliver of the ancient magic that first imprisoned it. That's why it was so powerful, so resilient. It wasn't just metal and stone. It was a living, breathing ward. Michael felt a surge of adrenaline, cutting through the haze of fear. So the object is gone. But what about the fragment? Was it destroyed with the box? Emily, who had been staring at the void, suddenly blinked, her eyes clearing with a terrifying clarity. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though tinged with a profound sadness. "It wasn't destroyed. It was absorbed. Look." She pointed not at the void, but at Michael's hand. Michael looked down. Clutched tightly in his fist, almost forgotten, was the small, obsidian shard he had picked up earlier, the one that had broken off the artifact when David first showed it to them. He'd kept it, a strange, inexplicable impulse driving him. Now it wasn't just obsidian. It pulsed with a faint, internal light, a deep, resonant blue that seemed to hum in defiance of the encroaching darkness. It was cold to the touch, yet radiated an ancient, undeniable power. It's drawing power from the entity," Jessica murmured, her analytical mind already trying to comprehend the impossible. "It's not just a piece of the containment. It's a siphon. It's absorbing the chaos, trying to reestablish the pattern, the order. The fragment, it's the key," David breathed, a sliver of desperate hope entering his voice. The prophecy said the echo could be slowed, perhaps even momentarily halted, by the heart of the first ward. This must be it. The thrumming intensified, shaking the very foundations of the lab. The impossible colors swirled faster, the air grew colder, and the void where the artifact had been began to expand, slowly, inexorably, pulling at the edges of their reality. Distant screams, faint at first, then growing louder, echoed through the shattered silence of the city, a testament to the entity's rapidly spreading influence. The world was indeed unprepared. Michael looked at the obsidian shard in his hand, then at his terrified friends, then back at the expanding void. The fragment pulsed, growing warmer now, almost burning. He felt a connection to it, a strange electrifying current that ran through his arm and into his very core. It was a terrible burden, a fragile hope, and a terrifying revelation. The entity was out, its purpose an existential threat. But the means to fight it, however small, however desperate, was now literally in his hand. The question was, what was he supposed to do with it? And could a single tiny shard of obsidian truly stand against an ancient evil that sought to erase existence itself, an evil that was now fully manifest, its tendrils reaching out to consume everything they had ever known? He stared at the tiny sliver of darkness in his palm, feeling its unnerving chill despite the terror raging within him. What was he supposed to do with it? And could a single tiny shard of obsidian truly stand against an ancient evil that sought to erase existence itself, an evil that was now fully manifest, its tendrils reaching out to consume everything they had ever known? The answer logically was no. It felt like holding a pebble against a tidal wave, a single spark against a cosmic wildfire. Despair, a cold, cloying hand, squeezed his heart. He felt utterly, hopelessly lost. The world outside the confines of their temporary sanctuary, Professor Elias's hidden study, pulsed with a malevolent energy, a distorted hum that vibrated in his teeth. He could feel it in his bones, a profound wrongness that permeated the very fabric of reality. Then a flicker, not of light but of purpose. The obsidian shard, previously inert, seemed to subtly deepen its color, absorbing the ambient dread, transforming it into a concentrated point of stillness. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense, he realized, but a focal point, a conduit. He remembered Elias's frantic, fragmented notes, the scrawled diagrams of ancient symbols, the desperate plea to find the counter-resonance. This wasn't about fighting fire with fire. It was about finding the silence within the scream, the order within the chaos. The shard wasn't meant to destroy the evil, but to re-establish the boundaries it had shattered, to mend the tear. A sudden violent tremor rocked the study. Books tumbled from shelves, glass vials shattered on the floor. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Outside, a guttural, inhuman shriek tore through the air, followed by the terrifying sound of rending metal and collapsing concrete. The city was not just under attack. It was being unmade. He had to find Jessica, David, and Emily. He had to know if they were safe. He shoved the shard into his pocket, its cold weight a constant reminder of his impossible burden. Bursting out of the study, he found himself in the main hall of Elias's secret network of tunnels. The air here was thick with an acrid smell, like ozone and burning leaves, but also something metallic and strangely sweet. The emergency lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. "Jessica! David! Emily!" he yelled, his voice hoarse, echoing eerily in the subterranean passages. A faint cough answered him from deeper within the tunnels. He rushed towards the sound, his heart pounding. Around a bend, he found them huddled together, their faces pale and streaked with grime. Jessica held a small, antique lantern, its dim glow barely piercing the gloom. David was slumped against the wall, clutching his arm, a nasty gash bleeding freely through his torn sleeve. Emily, surprisingly, looked the most composed, her eyes wide but determined, a thick, leather-bound journal clutched to her chest. "Michael! Thank God!" Jessica gasped, rushing to him. "The whole city, it's gone mad. The sky, it's not blue anymore. It's like a bruise." "David, what happened?" Michael knelt beside his friend, examining the wound. "Fell. Something hit the building above us," David grunted, wincing. "It's not just physical damage, Michael. People, they're changing. The fear, it's a wave. It's making them turn on each other or just dissolve." Dissolve. The word hung in the air, chilling them to the bone. It wasn't just destruction, it was erasure, just as Michael had feared. The ancient evil wasn't merely killing. It was unwriting existence. "Emily, what's that?" Michael pointed to the journal. "It's Professor Elias's," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I found it near his desk, hidden under a loose floorboard. It's his personal diary, not just his research notes. It fills in some of the gaps." She flipped through the brittle pages. He believed the Void Eater, as he called it, isn't from another dimension, but from before dimensions. Before creation. It yearns for the primal nothingness from which everything sprang, and it seeks to drag everything back into that oblivion. "And the obsidian?" Michael pressed, pulling the shard from his pocket. Emily's eyes widened as she saw it. "He called it the lattice key. He said it wasn't a weapon but a tuning fork for reality. It resonates with the fundamental structure of existence. The Void Eater thrives on chaos and fear, on the unraveling of things. The lattice key, when activated correctly, can re-establish the underlying patterns, the cosmic lattice that holds reality together." "Activated correctly?" Jessica asked, her voice laced with dread. "How do we do that?" Emily consulted the journal again, her brow furrowed. He wrote about points of convergence, places where the veil between what is and what wasn't is thinnest. He mentioned the original site of the artifact's discovery, the old observatory ruins on Mount Cinder, but also a place he called the Nexus of Echoes, a central point in the city where the collective memories and intentions of humanity are strongest. "The old library," David rasped, pushing himself up, his eyes suddenly clear despite the pain. It was built on the site of the city's first public gathering place, hundreds of years ago, a place of learning, of shared stories, of communal will. It holds the echoes of generations. Michael remembered the library, a beautiful sprawling building with a grand dome, now likely in ruins. But if Elias was right, the site itself was what mattered. The energetic footprint. "We have to go there," Michael stated, his voice firm, a newfound resolve hardening his features. "If the shard is a tuning fork, we need to strike it in the right place, where the resonance can spread." "It won't be easy," Jessica warned, gripping her lantern tighter. "The tunnels are collapsing in places, and above ground it's chaos. Pure, unadulterated chaos." As if on cue, a high-pitched, wailing sound echoed through the tunnels, growing rapidly louder. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated hunger. Something was coming for them. "We don't have a choice," Michael said, pushing himself to his feet. "David, can you walk?" David nodded grimly, using the wall for support. "I can walk. Just keep moving." "Emily, keep that journal safe," Michael instructed. "It might hold more answers we'll need." They moved as quickly as David's injury allowed, navigating the crumbling passages. The air grew heavier, the malevolent hum more intense. They heard scuttling sounds in the darkness, glimpses of amorphous shadows at the edge of the lantern's glow. The Void Eater wasn't just a distant force. Its manifestations were now hunting them, drawn by their hope, by the very light of their existence. They reached a junction where a gaping hole had appeared in the ceiling, revealing a sliver of the outside world. Jessica held up the lantern, and they peered upwards. What they saw stole their breath. The sky was a swirling miasma of bruised purples, sickly greens, and an unsettling inky black that pulsed with faint internal light. Buildings around them were twisted into impossible shapes, some dissolving into dust before their eyes, others stretching into grotesque parodies of architecture. And moving through it all like vast, predatory leviathans were the tendrils, not just abstract concepts anymore, but titanic, shadowy appendages, miles long, reaching down from the swirling abyss, consuming everything they touched. They were not merely physical. They seemed to drain the very color and substance from the world. "It's worse than I imagined," Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. "It's unmaking everything," Emily added, her eyes wide with a horrifying understanding. "It's trying to erase us from existence, to make it as if we were never here." Michael felt the obsidian shard in his pocket grow colder, almost painfully so. It was reacting to the scale of the unmaking, a tiny point of resistance against an infinite void. He pulled it out, and this time it was unmistakably glowing with a faint, internal light, a deep, resonant indigo. "It's working," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "It's reacting. It knows where it needs to be." The glow pulsed, growing brighter, illuminating the faces of his friends with its strange, ethereal light. Hope, fragile but persistent, flickered in their eyes. "We follow the light," Emily declared, pointing towards a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a subtle distortion that seemed to be drawing the obsidian's glow. "It's guiding us." They emerged from the tunnels into a nightmare landscape. The streets were deserted, but not empty. Figures once human now shambled aimlessly, their forms indistinct, their eyes hollow, their minds wiped clean by the overwhelming dread. Some simply stood, slowly dissolving into motes of dust that drifted away on an unseen wind. The air itself seemed to hum with the collective agony of a dying world. They moved stealthily, keeping to the shadows of the warped buildings, avoiding the dissolving figures. David, despite his injury, moved with a surprising resilience, driven by a primal need for survival. Jessica kept watch, her lantern sweeping through the eerie gloom, her face a mask of grim determination. Emily, clutching Elias's journal, occasionally glanced at the shard in Michael's hand, her understanding growing with each pulse of its indigo light. The library, when they finally spotted it, was a grotesque monument to the unmaking. Its grand dome was cracked, but still largely intact, a defiant sphere against the bruised sky. Yet, around it, the very ground seemed to be dissolving, revealing the ancient earth beneath, a void-black chasm that pulsed with the same malevolent energy as the tendrils above. The building was teetering on the edge of oblivion, a last bastion of order against the encroaching chaos. "It's drawing it in," Emily gasped, pointing to the chasm. "The nexus of echoes. It's where the Void Eater is focusing its power, trying to unmake our history, our very foundation." Michael felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with dread. They had found the location. But it was also the heart of the storm. The indigo glow of the obsidian shard intensified, growing almost painful to look at, vibrating in his hand. It was pulling him, urging him forward towards the library, towards the chasm, towards the ultimate confrontation. As they approached the library's main entrance, a chilling sound echoed from within, a sustained deep hum, like 1,000 ancient voices whispering secrets of non-existence. The doors, once grand and ornate, now hung askew, almost ripped from their hinges. Beyond them, the vast interior of the library was a spectacle of impossible architecture. Bookshelves twisted upwards into the gloom, their contents dissolving into dust. The air shimmered with an unbearable pressure, a crushing weight that threatened to flatten them where they stood. And in the center of the grand reading room, where the dome soared above, was the core of the nightmare. A swirling vortex of pure nothingness, a black hole of non-existence, slowly expanding, devouring everything around it. It was the heart of the Void Eater's manifestation, the gateway to primal oblivion. And within its swirling depths, Michael could almost perceive a shadowy, formless intelligence, ancient beyond comprehension, utterly alien, utterly hostile. "That's it," Michael breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "That's where we have to go." The obsidian shard pulsed violently, its indigo light now casting deep, dancing shadows across their faces. It was screaming at him, demanding to be used, to be placed. But how? How could a single fragile object, held by a terrified man, possibly hope to counter a force that sought to unravel the very fabric of reality? A force that was now fully and terrifyingly present, manifesting as a gaping wound in the heart of their world. The chasm of non-existence pulsed, growing larger, its gravitational pull on reality becoming unbearable. They were standing on the precipice of everything, and the only way forward was into the abyss. The very air around them fractured, shimmering like heat haze over asphalt, but instead of heat, it was the cold of absolute vacuum, sucking the warmth from their skin, the sound from their ears. Dust motes, once dancing in the weak light, elongated into impossible streaks before vanishing entirely. A chair, overturned in the chaos, began to unravel from its edges, its wood grain blurring into a fractal pattern of non-being, then simply ceasing to be. The chasm wasn't just growing, it was eating. It was a hungry void, not merely consuming space, but consuming the very concept of what occupied that space. Michael felt a strange disorientation, a flicker at the edge of his perception. Was that a memory of his childhood home, briefly superimposed over the crumbling wall, only to dissolve like smoke? Emily clutched her head, a low moan escaping her lips. It's trying to unmake us," she whispered, her voice thin, as if the sound itself was struggling to exist. "Not just our bodies but our minds, our histories." David, his face grim, adjusted his glasses, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chilling void. "The Chronos shard isn't just creating a spatial anomaly," he rasped, his voice strained. "It's a temporal ontological collapse. It's erasing time and being from this point outwards. If we don't stop it, there won't be a before or after. There won't be us." Jessica, ever the pragmatist, slammed a fist onto a console that groaned under the strain, its lights flickering erratically. "So what's the plan, Einstein? We can't just stand here and watch the universe get deleted." David pointed to a complex diagram flickering on a rapidly destabilizing monitor. "The energy readings, they're spiking exponentially. It's reaching a critical mass. We have one chance, a desperate, almost suicidal long shot. We can't destroy the shard. Not without risking an even more catastrophic feedback loop that could wipe out everything instantly. But we might be able to force it into a stable, contained state of non-existence. A localized quantum vacuum. A bubble where its existence is nullified, isolated from the rest of reality." Michael stared at the monitor, then at the pulsating, expanding void that already consumed half the laboratory. A bubble of nothingness, inside a bigger nothingness? "Precisely," David confirmed, nodding. "We harness the residual energy signature of its own collapse, amplify it through the containment field emitters we've been trying to build, and then we hit it with a reverse phase temporal ontological pulse. It's like fighting fire with anti-fire. It should, theoretically, cause the shard to fold in on itself, becoming inert, a singularity of non-being that can no longer interact with our reality." His eyes met Michael's, reflecting the terrifying gravity of the situation. "But it requires us to get close. dangerously close, and it's a one-shot deal. If we miss, or if the feedback is too strong, we'll be erased along with it, probably before we even register it. Emily, pale but resolute, asked, "How close is dangerously close?" "Within 10 feet of the shard's primary field," David replied. "The chasm's gravitational pull on reality will be immense. We'll be fighting against the universe trying to unmake us." Michael made a decision. There was no other option. "All right, Jessica, can you stabilize the power conduits long enough for David to calibrate that pulse?" Jessica was already moving, her fingers flying across the sparking console. "I can try, but these systems are fighting me. The shard's influence is corrupting the programming itself. It's like trying to fix a ship while it's actively sinking." "Emily," Michael turned to her, "your connection to the shard, can you sense its core? Its focal point within that expanding void? We need precision. David's pulse needs to hit the exact epicenter of its influence." Emily closed her eyes, swaying slightly. Her face contorted in a silent struggle. It's like a scream, but a scream of silence. A vortex of anti-memory. "I can feel it, Michael. It's deeper than the physical chasm. It's a wound in the fabric of everything. Yes, I think I can guide you, but it's pulling at me, trying to unravel my own thoughts." "Then we have to be fast," Michael declared, grabbing a reinforced energy conduit that David had prepared. "David, give me the parameters. I'll deploy the pulse emitter manually." David's eyes widened. "Michael, that's insane. The field distortion alone will tear you apart." "And what's the alternative?" Michael countered, gesturing to the expanding void. "We all vanish. At least this way there's a chance. Tell me what I need to do." With a nod, David began rattling off coordinates, energy frequencies, and activation sequences, his voice quick and urgent. Jessica wrestled with the failing power systems, sparks flying from severed wires as she bypassed safeguards, forcing the remaining power into the emitters. Emily stood rigidly, her hands pressed to her temples, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she focused on the unseen core of the Chronos shard. The air grew heavier, thicker, yet paradoxically thinner. The light in the room dimmed, not because of power failure, but because the concept of light itself was being eroded. Shadows became deeper, consuming definition, bleeding into the very objects they fell upon. Cracks spiderwebbed across the floor, not physical damage, but tears in the spatial continuum, revealing glimpses of nothing. Just the deep, consuming blackness of the abyss, closer now, breathing down their necks. Michael, carrying the heavy, cumbersome pulse emitter, a device bristling with shimmering crystals and intricate wiring, began his perilous advance. Each step was a battle. The floor beneath his feet felt like shifting sand, then like brittle glass, then like nothing at all. His body felt lighter, then heavier, then distorted, as if his own mass was fluctuating, being questioned by the encroaching void. A metallic taste filled his mouth, the taste of reality fraying. He could feel the pull now, an irresistible suction on his very being. It wasn't just physical, it was an ontological draft trying to unmoor his memories, his identity, his sense of self. He focused on Emily's strained voice guiding him. "Left, no, slightly right. It's shifting. It's reacting to our intent." The shard, unseen within the roiling blackness, was fighting back. The chasm pulsed with a darker, more aggressive energy. The disintegration accelerated. A section of the ceiling above them simply ceased to be, revealing a swirling vortex of nothingness where the sky should have been. Jessica screamed as a burst of feedback sent sparks showering from her console, searing her hands. She ignored the pain, frantically rerouting power. "I'm losing control. The conduits are failing. David, how much longer?" "Almost there. Michael, you need to activate it now. The window is closing," David yelled, his fingers flying across his own interface, trying to synchronize the external containment fields with Michael's manual deployment. Michael was within meters of the pulsing void. The air here was not just cold, it was empty. He could feel the edges of his own existence blurring. His arm, holding the emitter, felt like it wasn't quite his arm anymore, but a temporary construct. He could see his breath, not condensing in the cold, but simply fading, half-formed, into the surrounding non-space. "Emily, exact coordinates," Michael roared, fighting against the overwhelming pull that threatened to tear him apart. Atom by atom, memory by memory. Emily's eyes snapped open, wide and wild. "There. Straight ahead." It's a pinprick of anti-light, at the very center of the maelstrom. You have to push through the resistance. With a primal yell, Michael lunged forward, forcing his way into the heart of the distortion. The world around him twisted into a kaleidoscope of impossible geometry, then dissolved into pure chaos. He felt a sudden, agonizing jolt, as if his very soul was being stretched thin, pulled taut across an infinite void. He saw flashes of events that never happened, felt emotions that weren't his own, heard whispers of realities that had been unmade. This was the Chronos Shard's true power, the ability to erase not just the present, but all possible pasts and futures. He raised the emitter, its crystals humming with a desperate, building energy. Just as his hand began to fade, becoming translucent at the edges, he slammed the activation button. A blinding flash erupted, not of light but of anti-light, a ripple of reverse energy that seemed to suck the very photons out of existence. It was a silent, deafening explosion of nullification. The chasm, which had been expanding outwards, shuddered violently. For a terrifying moment it seemed to grow even faster, consuming the flash itself, threatening to swallow Michael whole. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the expansion faltered. The roiling blackness began to contract, pulling in on itself with an inward implosion of impossible force. The tearing sound of reality, which had been a constant hum, became a sharp tearing shriek. Michael was caught in the epicenter, feeling the universe itself trying to reassert its order, violently, painfully. The ground buckled beneath him, not from an earthquake, but from the sudden jarring snap of existence struggling to mend itself. The air rushed back in, cold and sharp, filling the vacuum. The distorted walls of the lab wavered, then solidified, albeit cracked and scarred. The light, though still dim and flickering, seemed to regain its purpose. The chasm, moments ago an infinite maw, was shrinking rapidly, collapsing into a single intensely dark point. It was folding in, consuming its own destructive energy. Michael felt himself being violently thrown backward by the concussive force of the implosion, landing hard on the scorched floor. When he finally looked up, gasping for breath, the vast, terrifying void was gone. In its place, at the very center of the lab where the Chronos Shard had been, there was now a small, perfectly spherical object. It was utterly black, absorbing all light, yet it didn't feel like a physical object. It felt like a hole in reality, a perfectly contained singularity of non-existence, humming with a faint, almost imperceptible low frequency. They had done it. They had forced the shard to contain itself. The immediate threat of universal erasure was averted, but the silence that followed was not one of relief, but of profound unease. The spherical void pulsed, a quiet, insistent beat. It was contained, yes, but it was still there. A perfect, unyielding sphere of nothingness, sitting in the heart of their damaged world. It was a victory, but one tinged with the chilling realization that they had merely traded one impossible problem for another. The Chronos Shard was no longer expanding, but it had become something else entirely. A permanent, silent testament to the void it had almost unleashed. And as Michael stared at it, a cold dread began to creep in. How do you contain something that is, by its very nature, the absence of everything? How do you contain something that is, by its very nature, the absence of everything? That question echoed in Michael's mind like a death knell, a chilling whisper from the void itself. The shimmering, almost invisible sphere that now occupied the center of their reinforced lab was not an object in the traditional sense. It was a perfectly spherical pocket of absolute nothingness, held in place by an agonizingly precise energy field that pulsed with a silent, desperate hum. It was a containment of a vacuum, a prison for a philosophical concept, and it demanded an impossible vigilance. They had done it. They had stopped the expansion. They had prevented the world from being swallowed by a hungry, formless oblivion. But the victory felt hollow, a reprieve purchased at an unimaginable price. The lab, once a place of innovation and discovery, had become a mausoleum, a tomb for a force that was neither living nor dead, but simply not. Michael and Emily became hermits, their world shrinking to the four walls of the containment chamber. They couldn't leave. Not truly. Who would maintain the field? Who would monitor the infinitesimal fluctuations that signaled the void's restless pressure against its invisible cage? Their lives transformed into a grueling, sleep-deprived vigil. Every spare moment was spent reinforcing the field's generators, calibrating the energy projections, checking the integrity of the specialized alloys they'd used to line the walls. They ate, slept, and breathed the sterile, humming air of the lab, forever tethered to the silent horror they had trapped. The void, even contained, exerted a subtle, insidious influence. The air around the sphere was unnaturally cold, a biting chill that seeped into their bones, no matter how high they cranked the heating. Electronics within a 10-foot radius would occasionally glitch, screens flickering with static, data corrupted without explanation. Plants they foolishly tried to keep in the lab for a touch of life withered at an accelerated rate, their leaves browning and crumbling as if their very essence was being slowly drawn away. It was as if the void, unable to consume matter, was instead leaching meaning and vitality from its surroundings. Emily, once so vibrant and full of scientific curiosity, grew pale and gaunt. Her eyes, once sparkling with intelligence, now held a haunted, distant look. She spoke less, her movements becoming slow and deliberate, as if every action required immense effort. She spent hours simply staring at the containment field, sometimes with a look of desperate fear, other times with an unsettling, almost mesmerized blankness. Michael knew she was reliving the moment the void had almost claimed her, the terrifying glimpse into ultimate non-existence. He tried to reach her, to pull her back, but his own mind was being slowly eroded by the constant pressure. Michael too felt the change. He became obsessed, his every thought consumed by the containment. Sleep was a luxury he rarely afforded himself, punctuated by nightmares of an ever-expanding darkness. He saw patterns in the static on the monitors, heard whispers in the hum of the generators. He began to believe the void wasn't just a force, but something with a nascent, malevolent will, silently probing its prison, searching for a weakness and escape. He felt its presence, a constant, crushing weight on his psyche, a silent voice that promised ultimate peace and surrender. Their relationship, once a bedrock of shared passion and mutual respect, fractured under the strain. Words became scarce, replaced by anxious glances and unspoken fears. Intimacy was a forgotten luxury. They were no longer partners in life, but co-conspirators in a cosmic secret, two condemned souls chained to an impossible task. Michael saw the fear in Emily's eyes, but also a growing resentment, a silent accusation that he had dragged them both into this living hell. And perhaps she was right. One evening, as the lab's automated systems reported a fractional drop in the field's energy output, Michael felt a surge of cold dread. He rushed to the console, his fingers flying across the holographic interface, adjusting, compensating. He felt the void push back, a silent mental pressure that made his teeth ache. He realized then that the energy they were pouring into the field wasn't just mechanical. It was drawing on them. Their focus, their fear, their very life force. It was all being subtly siphoned, absorbed into the impossible task of containing nothing. He looked at Emily, slumped in a chair, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. He saw the toll it was taking, the slow, inevitable decay of their spirits. He knew they couldn't last forever. The void didn't need to break out physically. It was already consuming them from the inside out. A terrifying yet strangely logical thought began to form in Michael's mind. The void was the absence of everything. It could not be truly contained by physical means alone. It required an anchor, a constant, conscious will to define its boundaries. Someone had to be the wall, the edge of the abyss. He spent days poring over their theoretical notes, the obscure quantum physics, the almost mystical equations they had stumbled upon. He found a forgotten passage, a half-joking hypothesis about a conscious anchor for non-dimensional phenomena. What if the most stable form of containment for something that was the absence of reality was a reality that willed it to be contained? A living, breathing consciousness that became the absolute boundary. The idea was horrifying. It meant merging with the containment, becoming a part of the field itself, a living barrier. It meant sacrificing his mind, his identity, his very self to become a permanent, conscious prison for the void. But it also meant Emily could be free. She could leave this tomb, tell their story, warn the world. Or, at least, try to live a life untainted by the impossible task. He didn't tell Emily his plan. He knew she would fight him, try to find another way. But there was no other way. He could feel the void's subtle whispers growing louder, its promise of oblivion more alluring. He had to act before it consumed them both. One chilling morning, Emily woke to find Michael standing before the containment field, not adjusting controls, but simply staring into the shimmering emptiness. His body was rigid, his hands clasped before him, almost as if in prayer. A faint, almost imperceptible glow emanated from him, mirroring the field's own silent pulse. "Michael," she whispered, her voice hoarse with fear. He didn't turn. His eyes fixed on the void seemed to deepen, to lose their individual spark, becoming vast and ancient, like windows into an endless night. It needs an anchor, Emily, he said, his voice strangely calm, resonant, yet distant, as if coming from a great distance. A conscious boundary. A definition of here versus not here. Panic seized Emily. She knew what he was doing. She saw the faint ethereal tendrils of light and shadow beginning to weave from his body into the containment field. A symbiotic intertwining. No, Michael. What are you doing? Stop. She rushed forward, but an invisible barrier, crackling with static energy, repelled her. The force field around the void was not just containing the nothingness. It was now extending subtly to encompass Michael, drawing him into its silent embrace. It can't be truly contained otherwise, he continued, his words slow, deliberate, each one a profound sacrifice. It will always push. It will always seek to unravel. I have to be the wall, Emily. I have to be the no. His form began to blur, his outline softening, his edges dissolving into the shimmering field. The glow around him intensified, and the hum of the generator seemed to merge with a new, deeper vibration. A silent chord struck between man and void. His eyes, still fixed on the nothingness, were now utterly devoid of personal recognition, reflecting only the infinite, the absence of self. He was still Michael, yet he was also something else entirely. A living, breathing containment field, a human boundary against the ultimate unknown. Emily screamed, a raw, primal sound of despair and horror. She pounded on the invisible barrier, tears streaming down her face, watching as the man she loved became one with the very thing they had fought so hard to imprison. His body remained a silent sentinel, but his mind, his soul, his everything was now inextricably linked to the void, an eternal guardian, a conscious prison wall. The lab fell silent, save for the low, steady hum of the perfectly stable containment field. Michael was gone, yet he was eternally present, a permanent fixture, an unmoving, unthinking anchor. The void was contained, yes, perfectly, absolutely. But at what cost? Michael had become the haunted object, a living testament to the uncontainable, his existence now a silent scream against the encroaching nothingness. And as Emily stared at his vacant form, now indistinguishable from the field's own shimmering energy, she understood the terrible truth. The void had not been defeated. It had simply found a new, more insidious way to exist in the world, forever tethered to a human soul, a permanent, silent testament to the void it had almost unleashed. And as Emily stared at it, a cold dread began to creep in. How do you contain something that is, by its very nature, the absence of everything?